hope that you'll recall that at the end of last week, I was sort of talking about late 17th century France and the French faith in this utopic possibility of human transformation, which was also really conflated with assimilation, right? And they were both part of French colonial expansion into the New World in particular. And I also kind of suggested that this idea, this philosophy of, or this belief in human perfectibility also ran through many of Madame d'Aulnoy's tales, which involve very fantastic metamorphosis. And hopefully you had a chance to read Prince Marquessan for today. And she has a lot of stories that involve animal enchantments. And in those stories of animal enchantments, I want to argue we really are seeing the kind of background of this French idea from the 17th century about transformation, assimilation, and really the possibility of human perfectibility. For d'Aulnoy in particular, the boundary between the animal and the human was a very porous one, right? That humans and animals moved back and forth across that boundary in both literal and figurative ways. And I think this makes great sense in her particular cultural context. That is, she was influenced by France's colonial expansion in the New World, where we really see a lot of similar ideas. And as I hope I kind of laid the groundwork for, began to make clear last week, New France, what we know of as Eastern Canada today, was really itself like a fantastic site, right? It was like a site of a lot of imperial imagination. And there, the animal, the category of the animal was often conflated with the category of the sauvage, right? Les sauvages, which was a term given to the inhabitants of the New World. And of course, that term, les sauvages, was racially inflected. So in French, sauvage means wild or undomesticated or uncultivated, not necessarily the savage that it gets translated to when it's translated into English, but still this range of terms or this range of meanings: wild, uncultivated, not domesticated. Those meanings, whether they're implicit or explicit, they still highlight, I think, contemporary concerns about where precisely les sauvages might fall between animal and man. And in those conversations about where les sauvages should be positioned relative to animal and man, they of course meant relative to white European man, right? So there was this sort of universal assumption of what humanity meant there. But this sort of uncertainty about les sauvages and their kind of liminal status, in some cases, they were really described as having these sort of animal instincts. And then, of course, in other cases, very much like human beings, this kind of liminality or uncertainty about their status made them sort of perfect candidates for applying the theories of French perfectibility and applying ideas of assimilation. That these were people who could prove that anybody could become French, right? So in 17th century New France, assimilation was also known as Frenchification, right? And it included everything from dress to bodily comportment and discipline and behavior, to various kinds of religious beliefs and everyday action. And as I mentioned, assimilation, Frenchification, played a really big role in colonial expansion. It was part of the sort of ideology and approach to colonial expansion in North America in particular. And in that particular colonial setting, Frenchification focused most specifically on conversion or assimilation to Catholicism and to French civility. So I think in very similar fashion, d'Aulnoy's fairy tales of metamorphosis participate in the transformation of animals into civilized, often aristocratic human beings. And her enchanted animal characters also tend to occupy these very ontologically ambiguous positions because their animal states often come about as a result of some kind of curse or enchantment. So they're not by their nature animals, and they're not quite human. So they occupy this position, this ontological position, this question about who they are, what they might be, that's very similar to Les Sauvages, right? So in both D'Aulnoy's tales of fantastic metamorphosis and in the broader colonial imagination, the bodies and habits, as well as, of course, the minds and souls and the cultural practices and beliefs of animal-like others become very specifically French idealizations for human perfectibility. So of all of D'Aulnoy's tales of metamorphosis, and again, there are quite a few, Prince Marquessan, which I hope you all now have and had a chance to read, I think really best exemplifies this conversion of fairy tale metamorphosis and colonial policies of Frenchification and assimilation. So for instance, although Prince Marquessan, quote, initially, quote, fed like a wild boar in whom the desire for life is strong, he's ultimately provided with 6 nurses, including 3 dry nurses who were, quote, always giving him Spanish wines and cordials to drink, which taught him early to be a judge of the best wines, right? So additionally, his mother, the queen, covers him in ribbons, has his ears pierced. He's also dressed, quote, in long garments covering his limbs and an English cap of black velvet to conceal his head, his ears, and part of his snout. Even more, Prince Marquessan is taught, or we could say forced, to walk on his hind legs, to wear shoes and silk stockings, and in essence, quote, no pains were, maybe can I make this smaller so other people, no pains were spared to teach him dainty ways and good manners. And quote, he was beaten when he grunted. In short, insofar as it was possible, they weaned him from wild boar habits. So implicit in this kind of summary description of all the things that the queen and the court did to civilize Prince Marquessan, you see he still needs to be beaten at times, and they did everything as far as possible to wean him from his wild boar habits. So despite all of the attempts at civilizing him, at transforming him, there are these implicit frustrations about that process. And those frustrations echo the kinds of writings we have from the New World, especially from missionaries who were similarly trying to transform seminarians or les sauvages or the natives in very similar ways. That is that they were often frustrated by the processes of Frenchification and the difficulty of achieving easy sort of French civilization and Catholicism. And one of the reasons, according to them, as well as to D'Aulnoy, is really because of this liminal status, right? Because the character, the person is both kind of animal and human at the same time. Yeah, Cher?
So how, I mean, these were, you said mainly aristocratic transformations. How were the French peasants viewed in terms of this idea of Frenchification?
Well, that's a great question. So for the online folks, if you didn't hear, Cher is asking about transformations of peasants versus aristocrats. So in the tales, all the metamorphoses are among aristocrats, right? That's just the world of the tales. In French culture, there was this belief that anyone could be Frenchified, right? Or could be made into a more perfect person. So that was mostly applied in New France, but carried over certainly into France itself. there was also a lot of anxiety about class structure and class position. So there was only so much perfecting, right, that one wanted to do in France, right? Whereas in New France, it was separate enough, I think. So yeah, Allison.
Kind of following up on that, but this was the 18th century. Correct?
This is the late 17th century.
So the audience of reading these fairy tales, assuming many people were illiterate and peasants.
Yeah, so the tales were mostly told among aristocratic women. So they would write tales and tell tales in salons to each other. And then they were published also, and they had very aristocratic reading audiences. They were also read at court, things like that. So yeah, so, and it was really, there were often a large number of coded discourses about feminism. And that's what I think why a lot of women read each other too, because it was the space where they could really make claims about women's position and women's contributions to culture and society that weren't sort of able to be made outside of there. But it did also become a very big cultural phenomenon, so when lower classes would have been engaged with tales, they would have been told orally, probably mostly through oral tradition. And so they weren't exactly these tales, although some of these tales certainly would have been read aloud and then learned and passed on that way. So there's always this kind of like interweaving of the oral and the literary.
Because I had never heard of this fairy tale before. Do they know it in France now? We only know the ones that the Grimm and the Disney and
Yeah, so that's a question about how well these tales are known now. Through the 18th century, Madame d'Aulnoy's tales were canonical, and they were in all sorts of anthologies, and they were very well known. Like many people in France, not just aristocrats, would have known them. And then there was a move to make canons of knowledge much more associated with the university, and it became a much more male-dominated realm. And so all these writings by women fell out of the canon. And then they were not lost to us, but neglected to scholars until really the 20th century. And then they've been sort of rediscovered. So now, certainly you can find many of these tales. I think Mark found all of d'Aulnoy's collection online, but they're not anywhere near as well known as the Grimms, who were really published very widely in the 19th century. And Andrew Lang, yeah. Yes, the La Fontaine, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
So were these tales also read to children?
Not so much, right? Children probably were not very present at court. And they weren't intended for children in the same way that the Grimm's tales were very much intended for children.
Right, but also Aesop's fables, for instance, they all have a moral story there, and they're meant for everybody.
Yes, certainly. Yes, certainly. And in this time period, we didn't have really a distinction between child and adult the way that we do now. So certainly children may have been present, but they weren't intended for children in the same way. At the same time period, there was a writer who was really pushing back against the prominence of female fairy tale writers and was trying to secure this image of fairy tales as only those things told orally by old working women to children. His name's Charles Perrault. His tales are very famous to us. They're the ones that get carried on into the Grimms and that we're probably more familiar with today. And they were written specifically with morals to them. But these tales, like Bessile's tales, children may have encountered, but they weren't intended for children in the way that the Grimms were specifically intended for children. Yeah. Okay, so I was saying, I think that the kind of frustrations of trying to humanize or civilize Prince Marquessan, despite some of his wild boar ways, right, that were so ingrained in him, really echoed the same kind of frustrations that missionaries felt about les sauvages or the seminarians that they were working with in New France. And so, you know, as a result of this, despite Prince Marquesan's dress, his education, his training in courtly manners, his animal nature continues to exert itself, and it really prevents his complete assimilation into French culture. And so after two disastrous, or at least what appear to be two disastrous attempts at marriage, in which he kills his brides on their wedding night because of their deceptions, Prince Marquesan gets really frustrated and he decides to leave court for the forest, where he, quote, began to lead the life of his wild boar kindred. And there he learns that, quote, nothing in the world demands I think I'm missing a word. Nothing in the world demands more from freedom than the heart. And he, quote, sees that all the animals are happy because they live without constraint. So here, Prince Marquesan's kind of appreciation of the forest as this symbol of freedom really recalls writings that we have from Marie de l'Incarnation, who I mentioned last week, the most famous kind of Ursuline missionary, in which she's continually writing with regret about the seminarians who, whenever they have a chance, escape the convent to go run wild in the forest. And she's always interpreting this as their nature, allowing them to, or pushing them to resist the attempts to restrain them and constrain them, right? And so I would argue that in very clear fashion, Prince Marquesan's sauvage nature similarly prevails over all these extensive attempts to, quote unquote, humanize him. And yet this understanding of the heart's need for freedom strikes a particularly human note, right? That's a very human idea. And so it's with this kind of sensibility in the forest that Prince Marquesan woos Marthésie, the youngest daughter of the two sisters he had previously married. But, you know, this process is slow and complicated, and he finds here too that his animal nature, how come I can't advance my slide? Okay, there we go. He says, there must be, he said to her with a wild boar smile, something human mingled with the animal in me. This breaking of my promise for which you blame me, this little trick by which I gained my end, these show the man in me. For to speak frankly, there is more honor amongst animals than amongst men. So here again, we see the constant blending of animal and human nature in Prince Marquesan. And that really exposes the conflicted ideologies implicit in the colonial project of Frenchification. This is no simple allegory of successful imperial metamorphosis, right? Prince Marquesan, the story, instead highlights for us the very divergent beliefs that coexisted about les sauvages. At times they were noble, they were brave, they were courageous, they were upheld for those characteristics. And at other times they were animalistic, barbaric, and filthy, right? They were constantly described in both of those languages. So even more than just representing those kinds of colonial themes and these ideas about assimilation or Frenchification in the New World, Prince Marquesan, the story, and D'Aulnoy are actually actively engaged in the conversation, right? That is, they are contributing to and shaping that conversation. And I think this is especially clear in the title, Prince Marquesan. And this story, by the way, was one of two late 17th century versions of a story that's usually called The Pig Prince, that was written by Straparola in the early 16th century. So whereas Straparola and Murat, the other author of the late 17th century pigtale, both use the term cochon or pork, that is the domesticated pig, in the titles and in the names for their characters. D'Aulnoy names, you know, the character Marcassin, meaning wild boar. And when she's not referring to him as Marcassin as a proper name, she refers to him as Le Sanglier, also a term for wild boar. So we see this as a real contrast, obviously, with cochon or porc, the domesticated pig. So I think that these linguistic choices make especially clear that D'Aulnoy's Prince Marcassin, the story, is a narrativization of the tensions implicit in the French civilizing process, not only for fairy tales, of course, but also for the inhabitants of New France. And in this context, I think D'Aulnoy's choice of Marcassin is even, and Sanglier, is even more significant because according to this historian, Gordon Sayre, who's citing the Jesuit relations, and remember the Jesuit relations were basically like ethnographic texts written by Jesuit missionaries, and they had a huge audience in France. People would wait for them to be published. So in the Jesuit relations, Gordon Sayre points out that in the Jesuit relations, Huron, right? And remember, the Huron were France's greatest native allies. They went to war with them, often against the British and the British native allies, but they also were the ones with whom they were doing the most missionary work. And so they were the ones that the French were writing ethnographically about the most. So Sayre lets us know that Huron alluded to the practice of shaving the head, except for a few small tufts or straight locks, like the bristles of a wild boar, as this is what hure signifies in French, right? So this is being published again in the 17th century. Gordon Sayre is a contemporary writer, but he's quoting the Jesuit relations. So D'Aulnoy's description of Prince Marcassin as having bristles that stood up in a fearsome way, and also describing him as proud looking, suggests to me that her choice to use Marcassin over cochon or pork is not just a writing of the Prince Pig as a general universal other, right? But a very specific kind of other in New France that would have been totally comprehensible during or through this French imperial imagination. That is, I'm trying to argue that Prince Marcassin is like a condensation of all the dominant cultural fantasies of colonization as a civilizing mission. So the other element of the story that I want to focus on is when Martha C. learns, to her dismay, and probably ours, and before the civilizing process is complete, that is before Prince Marcassin is changed into a man, that, quote, the Marcassin race was to be perpetuated, right? So given what we know about fairy tales, given the possibility of immediate disenchantment and transformation, right? Immediate metamorphosis from animal to man, it's very remarkable in this story that we have a long enough period of civilizing, right? That Martha civilizes Prince Marcassin over an extended period of time, so long, in fact, that it allows for her to become pregnant. And it really highlights this kind of cross-species miscegenation, or at least what appears to be cross-species miscegenation, right? Because in reality, that Prince Marcassin becomes a man at night, but neither he nor Martha seem to be aware of that fact, right? And so this is an example here that, to me, is pretty unusual for fairy tales, right? And we might call this sort of an enduring cross-species erotics. And there are several cases of this in Madame D'Aulnoy's tales. In fact, in The Dolphin, which you may have read that I talked about last week, I didn't talk about this part, but Leverett becomes pregnant by a bird, right? Who is really this prince who transforms himself into a bird, and she takes the bird on as her beloved pet, and at night he becomes a man, and for some reason nobody ever notices this. But there is this cross species erotics, right? And it's enduring. It's not just immediate. So this kind of example suggests an openness to interracial marriage that we just don't see very often in any context, but especially in the fairy tale context. But what's particularly remarkable was that there was a moment in New France where miscegenation, is mixed race marriages, were seen as a critical part of the assimilation process. It was seen as a critical part of Frenchification, that French women, and here's mostly the peasants, were sent to New France to civilize native men, right? So it was this very specific kind of project, and there's a lot of historical evidence for this, and it's all in my book, and I don't have time to go into it now, but there are a lot of paradoxes and contradictions implicit in ideas about les sauvages, right? In the colonial imagination, like I just mentioned, noble, brave, courageous, but also animalistic, filthy, barbaric. And so it's not very surprising that official French support for French native miscegenation and cohabitation was pretty short-lived. I mean, that shouldn't surprise anyone. In fact, by the late 17th century, by the time that D'Aulnoy was really publishing these tales, intermarriage of that sort was no longer really being pushed, even if it wasn't yet entirely prohibited. And these colonial policies and ideologies circulating around miscegenation in New France continue to inspire debate well into the first decades of the 18th century. One second, Mark, first.
Very independent, and I thought that role was significant as an example for if the audience was women, to see that there's a way of being that kind of sort of person.
Yeah, so Mark is making a comment about Martez's independence and her independent nature, and as part of what I've been calling a feminist fairy tale. And I think in many ways, it's also that she leaves court. So this story is also a critique of court society and the deceptions and the disingenuous nature of many of the actions in court. And so it's also aligned in that way, in important ways. Yeah. You can see I'm cutting a lot of the historical context and detail out. So these stories are operating on multiple registers, and one is that critique of court society. And I think we see that in Martez's actions, but also, as you're saying, her independence and how directive she is toward Prince Marquessan is also consistent with the gendered idea about intermarriage as this assimilative practice, that French women were the ones who were going to civilize les sauvages, the native men. Yeah, here and then there.
So I'm fascinated by this idea that French peasant women instead of to be married with, I guess, Indian men. So is there any non-fairy tale, I mean, true stories about what actually
Yeah. There's a lot of historical documentation. I don't know all of it extremely well. There were two things that happened. There was also an idea that kind of single French men who were often trappers and things like that would be assimilated if they also married native women. But what they found, French thought that that would be a way for natives to become more French. But what they found was that with the French men, they almost always went native, right? They became more native, they lived in these native communities and with those practices. If I'm remembering, I think I haven't read very much about what happened when native men married French women, but I think that the whole,
When the French, oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
and in those cases, it was such a short-lived experiment, I think, because it wasn't considered successful. So I don't know exactly what happened, but there is a lot of historical writing about this phenomenon. Yeah.
Are you making the distinction that the French women did not become Indian?
I think so, but I'm not 100% certain there. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
I was marrying women, so you not see that.
Yeah. So that for sure, I do remember that the men went native and that was a problem too. So that was like not what the French wanted. So they started to really intervene in these kinds of marriages, these intermarriages. Let's see. Okay. So as I mentioned, these conversations about miscegenation and these informal policies and ideas, as they were being debated more and more in New France at the end of the 17th century and into the beginning of the 18th century, that's when we really see their convergence with the racial formation projects of France's other colonial priorities, which were in the Caribbean, right? And there they have, in that colonial setting, ideas about race and miscegenation and sexuality have very different influences on the fairy tales that are emerging from that space. And we see this particularly in the Beauty and the Beast stories. And I gave you a short version to read, which is Beaumont's 1756 version, but the version of Beauty and the Beast that's most generally accepted as the first literary version was written by Gabrielle Suzanne Barbeau de Villeneuve in 1740, and it's a novella. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that one. So again, it's the first widely recognized literary version of the tale, and it's a novella. It's quite complicated. It has like 1,000 crazy plot lines and things, but the core of the story is very similar. And it's one of two novellas in a book called Le Jeune Américaine, The Young American Lady. And the two novellas are held together in this book by a frame tale. And it's in the frame tale that we really see the fantasies of imperial expansion that I would argue influence and really underpin her version of Beauty and the Beast and other versions of Beauty and the Beast going forward. So basically, the frame tale takes place on a ship that is traveling from France to Saint-Domingue, which is what we know today as Haiti, right? And it revolves around the return of a French plantation owner's daughter who has been in France being educated. And now she's returning to Saint-Domingue on the ship with her chaperone. She's to be wed when she arrives. And to pass the time, she asks the chaperone to tell some stories. And this leads directly into Beauty and the Beast. So there's clearly a connection between France's colonial holdings and Beauty and the Beast in our first literary version. As you may already know, by the early 18th century, Saint-Domingue was the centerpiece of France's empire. It was the largest producer of sugar in the world. It generated immense wealth for France, and it also relied on the greatest number of slaves by magnitudes of 10, or if not 100, like huge numbers of slaves. So set within this very specific political and economic context, Villeneuve's version of Beauty and the Beast is, of course, haunted by the presence of race and of colonial slavery. And again, there are so many examples in the book, in Le Jeune Américaine and in Beauty and the Beast, the novella, that make these connections clear. And I would be happy to talk with you about them sometime, but not today because I just don't have time. So mostly I want to focus on the beast and his sexuality, of course, and his transformation. And in particular, I want us to think about the beast's disenchantment, because that aspect of the story is a really dramatic point of comparison to D'Aulnoy's Tales of Metamorphoses, her animal groom tales, in which, again, that disenchantment is never instantaneous. Just as background, it's important to note that Villeneuve's descriptions of the beast share an ideological vocabulary with this nexus of African, slave, and animal. So African, slave, and animal were already conjoined in these really tightly bound ways, and the beast, the language of the beast, the description is part and parcel of those. And unlike many beast characters that we're familiar with from visual culture, this beast, for instance, has a trunk, like an elephant's trunk. And at this time, elephants would have been mostly associated with Africa for Europeans, not with Southeast Asia. So that's just one example. But the clearest way, the clearest example, and where there's the most evidence in the text of the beast's relationship to this kind of amalgamation of African, slave, animal, is in his implicit threat of sexuality, this kind of like hovering sexual threat that he supposedly poses to Beauty through most of the tale. And if you're familiar with the story in almost any versions, he asks her every night, will she sleep with him? And he asks her very clearly in the Villeneuve version, will you sleep with me? Whereas by the time we get later versions, it's often, you know, will you marry me, right? So it's a very different connotation in this version. And in fact, one critic describes the tale in relation to the African slaves' hypersexuality by saying, with each passing day, Bell becomes concerned that the beast's desire for sex is growing stronger than his self-control, and that the threat of sexual violation looms before her. So just a sense of how those are interrelated. Of course, as we know, at the pivotal moment, the scene of the beast disenchantment, although it's a little bit more extended in this version, we learn that all of Belle's fears are for naught. And in fact, there is an implicit legality to the vows that they exchange when she tells him that she loves him. So remember, she goes away and then she realizes that she loves him and she rushes back and she saves him. And when she proclaims his love for him, in the Beaumont version and later versions that we're familiar with, that's when he's disenchanted. That's all it takes. In this version, he still remains in his beast form, but there's a particular kind of legality that's almost like a wedding vow. It has some of the same language of those legal vows that they would have had at the time period. And on top of that, Villeneuve renders in very humorous language their first night together, again, before he's disenchanted. So we have a little bit of that cross-species thing, but it's made very clear very quickly that that's not what's going on. So that as they're about to go to bed together the first night, Belle is very worried, not about the sexual threat, but about, or at least not on the surface, what she's thinking about is like, is he going to be too big and break this bed? And yet what happens immediately is that he's snoring kind of deeply and loudly. And so it makes clear that his intentions have always been pure, like he falls asleep immediately, right? So all of her concerns, whether he's too heavy for the bed or whether there's going to be some kind of sexual threat, are totally absent from the story. And of course, we can see that the fact that the sexual threat was never there in the first place can easily be assimilated to the tale's lessons about appearances, right? And the fact remains that he's still, while he is the beast, he still figures that threat of animal sexuality. Like there's always kind of questions about his self-control. And in this way, the story is still kind of channeling these implicit fears of miscegenation, which in fact were much stronger in the Caribbean context, right? In the Caribbean context, the racialization of the other was so different that miscegenation was looked down upon from the very beginning in the Caribbean. And in fact, it was specifically outlawed by the Code Noir of 1724. So here I think what we see is that race, which is really made marvelous by beastly otherness, is no longer flexible. It's no longer unfixed as it was in D'Aulnoy's tales. And as a result, it's basically like removed in any complex, nuanced way from the animal groom tales. So the kind of quixotic possibilities of D'Aulnoy's animal-human couplings are entirely foreclosed in Villeneuve's and especially Beaumont's Beauty and the Beast tales, where the beast really has to be disenchanted and become a man before any significant kind of physical interaction happens with the virginal maiden, right? And certainly before their relationship is consummated. And obviously his disenchantment is much less involved. It's the consequence of this one night's deep, deep slumber. So he wakes up and he's, of course, a beautiful man. Or in Beaumont's version, by a simple kiss, right? And again, these are about the sort of moralizing lessons of appearances, but they really shift the focus, I think, from D'Aulnoy's much more ambiguous kind of ontological conclusions, right? That where transformation comes about from a much longer process, right, of civilizing, a much longer sort of Frenchification process, if you will. And I would say more than simple narrative choices, these really reflect the different time periods in France's history when these stories were written. Again, and France's different colonial policies. So D'Aulnoy, writing at the end of the 17th century, with really an eye to New France, where so much travel literature, the Jesuit relations, et cetera, was, where so much of that discourse was emerging, completely makes sense to have this longer civilizing process, this longer process of disenchantment. By the middle of the 18th century, when France's colonial priorities had shifted to the Caribbean with an entirely different racialization, right, with to a prized colony that depended on African slave labor, there was no longer any possibility of the beast and the female protagonist to be together before he's disenchanted. So many fairy tale scholars and critics have, of course, looked at beasts and ogres in the European fairy tale tradition, but they always tend to read them as just a fear of a generalized other. And what I'm trying to suggest here and lay the groundwork for throughout this book is that none of these things about otherness are general. They all emerge from very specific historical and political and colonial contexts. And I think we really see that in the difference between D'Aulnoy's animal metamorphoses and the later Beauty and the Beast tales. Okay, I'm only 5 minutes after. So let's take a break and then we'll come back and talk about the Grimms and Germany. To leave time for questions built in. So we're going to transition to the Grimms now, and I'm going to talk in particular about the two stories, the Three Black Princesses and the White Bride and the Black Bride, which maybe hopefully you had a chance to read. But first I want to set up some historical context, and then I'll try to close out by putting us in the bigger picture and setting us up for next week. Okay, so the kind of long century between the 1740 publication of Villeneuve's Beauty and the Beast, right, that we were just talking about, And the final highly crafted 7th edition of the Grimm's Kinder- und Hausmärchen, or Children's and Household Tales, in 1857, that long century, or what I'm calling a long century between 1740 and 1857, was really dominated by European preoccupation with human difference, right? And how that human difference manifested itself in cultural, economic, and moral ways, or what the cultural, economic, and moral implications of that human difference was. And so I just want to talk a little bit about that so that we have that as a backdrop for the two tales that I'm going to talk about here. One of the ways that this preoccupation manifested itself was in human typologies, or typologies of human difference. And certainly these kinds of typologies existed before the 18th century. But during the 18th century and into the early 19th century, we saw a huge burgeoning of these kind of like quote unquote scientific theories of race that established clear hierarchies of human difference. And those hierarchies were based on everything from beauty and strength to intelligence and industry, cleanliness, for instance. And probably not surprisingly, German thinkers and theorists placed themselves and other related North Europeans at the top of these hierarchies. And so while typologies of human variability were one expression of this European and especially German interest in this emergent race science, at the science of racial difference, they were certainly not the only forms that such conversations took place. But I like to highlight them here because the sort of reductive indices and the language associated with them, you know, beauty, strength, intelligence, industry, value, height, the color, those are all reproduced in the Grimm's language of the fairy tales, right? So typologies and fairy tales shared a very reductive binary kind of language. So as you may know, the Grimms were collectors of what I always describe as ostensible German legends, folk tales, and fairy tales. And I say ostensible because they felt that they were collecting oral stories that were the voice of the German people. But in fact, we know very clearly in documented ways that they collected from middle-class women who had emigrated from France, who had learned stories from French books. And probably already by this time, there's so much intermingling of stories, the circulation of stories with merchants and migrants and through books, et cetera, that there really is no such thing as a purely German or French or any, you know, specific kind of tale. We really see this migration a lot. But they were collectors of these ostensible German legends, tales, and fairy tales. They were also scholars. They were scholars of German legal history, and they were also early linguists. They were avowed romantic nationalists. This is why they were inspired to collect legends and tales. They felt like if they could showcase these narratives that represented the folk, you know, the voice of the people, so it's important to remember at this time, Germany was a bunch of municipalities also invaded by France, right? So they were occupied by France. So the Grimms believed as romantic nationalists that if they turned to the voice of the people, that they could convince all Germans that they were the same, right? So it's this kind of romanticism that led to the idea of the German nation. And of equal importance to me, I think, in my reading, they were pretty active anti-Semitic sympathizers, perhaps even activists. So because of these different, you know, scholarly and political affiliations and identifications, Jakob and Wilhelm were really immersed in the period's cultural discourses and conversations about human difference. And I would say even more than their own personal affiliations, the increasingly detailed and increasingly didactic and increasingly expanded versions of children's and household tales are marked in very profound ways by the ideologies of race circulating in and through their scholarly and political worlds of the time. And we have handwritten manuscript versions of the Grimm's initial collection from that's dated 1810. The first publication was 1812. And then we can compare that with all of the other subsequent edited versions, published editions that went through, as I mentioned, 7 editions through 1857. And when we compare those, we can see very clearly how the Grimms took sometimes tales that were 1 or 2 paragraphs and expanded them into pages. And they continued to edit these, often for language, often giving them what they felt were more of a feeling of what they expected the genre to be, the fairy tale, but also expanding them in ways that make clear their political ideologies. And not all of them are about race. Some of them, many of them are about gender, and there's been excellent work on that. But even when we're just looking at the racial discourses, we can really see how the edited versions over time expand to incorporate their personal and political views. So again, it's important as a backdrop to remember that this was a period of rapid European imperial expansion and fighting, right? For like the fight for Africa, South America a little bit, the Caribbean, this was a very fervent imperial time. It was also a time though of revolution. So that is also important to keep in mind. German Romantic nationalism was also happening. And so these kinds of cultural and political phenomenon were intersecting with also the emergence of this field of study called Orientalism, and also, as I mentioned, the sort of scientific and ethnological studies of race. And all of these things came together in this time, but also I think put into particularly sharp focus for us the contemporary questions surrounding Jewish emancipation in Europe. So European Jews had, of course, been subject to tremendous prejudice and oppression for centuries, but much of that prejudice was motivated by religious difference, and by an enduring sense that Jews were kind of a state within a state. That is, they were a people unto themselves, that they were unassimilable. During the late 18th century, however, debates about Jewish emancipation really coincided with this academic attention to Semitic languages, cultures, and people. And in this way, this kind of Orientalist theological scholarship helped to establish a correlation between theological prejudice, that's what I would say had been happening for centuries, and a kind of newer form of antagonism toward Jews and Judaism, which was really racially and politically charged. And it's this latter form of anti-Semitism that we see in the Grimm's collection, and that I read in connection with anti-Black racism as being really foundational to the logic of the collection as a whole. So, although explicitly Jewish characters are in only 3 of the Grimm's tales, and one of those tales is ambiguous in terms of how anti-Semitic it is, Wilhelm, who was really kind of the leader of the 2 brothers of this project, Wilhelm chose to include 2 of these anti-Semitic tales, and he chose the 2 undeniably anti-Semitic tales to include in what's called the small edition, which was a much abridged edition of their fairy tale collection that was marketed and intended specifically for children. And I think when we look at that fact, that these two tales were so significant to him, we can really see the ways that, as Martha B. Helfer says, that the collection has a conscious anti-Jewish agenda, or that a conscious anti-Jewish agenda arguably informs the Grimm's Kinder- und Hausmärchen. And so even if this is not the primary goal of the collection, it's important to understand the way that anti-Semitism is influencing and manifesting in the collection. I would say that that this fact is also supported by the fact that of the three of the three tales with specifically Jewish characters, all three of those tales have versions of this very same tale that feature main characters that are not Jewish. So we have this tale, right? All of these tales circulating with non-Jewish characters, and yet we have these very explicitly anti-Semitic tales in the Grimm's collection and in the small edition, right? The one intended specifically for children. And I think the most telling example of this is in the Grimm's tale called The Jew and the Thorn Bush, which to my reading is the most egregiously offensive of the collection's three narratives with Jewish characters. And in Wilhelm's 1815 notes to this tale, he omits any discussion of how the figure of the Jew came to take the central role, which was commonly occupied by a monk for the previous 200 years of the tale's history. And what we know about the tales and their notes is that they are extensive. Wilhelm in particular, but both brothers provided very, very detailed notes about where they collected the stories, what the stories are related to, what other versions there are, etc. And so there's no mention of the fact that this tale is most commonly known and had been for 2 centuries, most commonly known with a monk as the central figure. In addition to that, we know that in the 19th century in Germany, there were other collections of fairy tales that still continue to feature the version of the tale with the monk. So coincident with the Grimm's version, there is still in existence the versions with the monk. So again, I just mentioned this to lay some of the framework. So while the question of Jewish emancipation certainly played a role in the Grimm's overtly anti-Semitic tales, it was by no means the only pressing question of the day, right? It was not the only question to emerge from the sort of crucible of late 18th and early 19th century race, science, ethnology, and imperialism. And indeed, the question of slavery and its abolition inspired even greater moral and political debate across the European continent, as well as across the Atlantic. And so these things may seem very distinct, Jewish emancipation and Black abolition, and yet they were often politically and culturally linked in Germany in particular through parallel stereotypes of Jewish and Black racial difference from white Europeans, as well as through these kind of conceptual and ideological relays between nationalism and colonialism. So there was also at the time a longstanding belief that Jews had, quote, interbred with Arabs and Africans before they migrated to Europe. And that helped instantiate the idea of a kind of Jewish Blackness in European race science as early as the 18th century. And this idea became so compelling that by about 1860, Jews were regularly characterized in very specifically racialized ways as Black Negroes, Black Africans, and white Negroes. At the same time, characterizations of Black Africans resonated with the logic and language of anti-Semitism. And through such discourses, right, anti-Semitic connections or representations of Jews as Black and anti-Black descriptions invoking the language of anti-Semitism, we have these supposed affinities between German anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism, and they were completely naturalized for the ordinary. So within this context, Jews and Blacks were subject to a number of the same derogatory stereotypes, beliefs, and anxieties, including what one historian lists as, quote, an inability to speak proper German, an obscene and ridiculous love of finery, and an inherent laziness. And the latter, of course, was often invoked in comparison to German industriousness, which was really like a point of pride, like a very nationalist point of identification. And in addition, and not surprisingly, fears of miscegenation applied to both groups as well. So this, what I think of as a really profound ideological correspondence between late 18th and early 19th century anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism is perhaps best exemplified in this 1782 argument by a scholar named Johann David Michaelis, who had this fantasy of Jewish colonial deportation to what he longed for as what he called German sugar islands, okay? So this was propelled largely by a climate-based understanding of racial difference, that is, or human difference, that is this idea that the different climates that people were from led to different kinds of human traits, and that was what was responsible for human variability. So Michaelis argued that Jews were, quote, an unmixed race of a more Southern people. And as a result of that, according to him and his climate-based science, they would never have the bodily strength required to serve the German state through the military, right? He did, however, see a way for Jews to serve the nation, and it was one specific to their supposed origins in a Southern climate. Such people can perhaps become useful to us in agriculture and manufacturing if one manages them in a proper manner. They would become even more useful if we had sugar islands, which from time to time could depopulate the European fatherland. Sugar islands which, with the wealth they produce, nevertheless have an unhealthy climate. So here we see this proposal to deport Jews to a climate intolerable for Germans, but somehow inherently bearable for Jews. And it's a proposal predicated on the idea that the quote unquote degenerate Jews are a source of ready slave labor, right? Capable of freeing Germans from their dependence on other European powers for commodities, right? Like sugar. So here we really see, I think, the conflated logics of anti-Semitism and colonial anti-Black racism emerge with real force in this fantasy of a sugar island where we could deport Jews. So I like to give this example because it speaks to me so clearly about the intersections and relays between German anti-Semitism of the period and anti-Black racism. So I'm going to focus the rest of our time on talking about these two Grimm's tales featuring Black characters, but I wanted to just set that up so that we could understand the kind of racialized anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism that were co-constitutive. And even though there are only 3 tales with explicitly Jewish characters and only 4 tales with explicitly Black characters, I think this intersection provides a sort of foundation for a metaphoric understanding of many of the other details in the collection. That is, this intersection undergirds the collection as a whole, I would argue. So very few fairy tale scholars, if any, I would say, have addressed race in the Grimm's collection in any significant way. And those who've sort of done so in passing tend to let the Grimms off the hook by suggesting that they were just very interested in color symbolism. And that is absolutely true. The Grimms were very interested in color symbolism. And as we know from a couple other lectures that I've given in this class, Blackness, for instance, had very negative associations over many centuries in Europe. We talked about that last week. And so certainly color symbolism informs the Grimm's tales. But the fact that they're writing and editing these tales against a backdrop of racist typologies of human variability that often relied on color symbolism, that questions of human difference saturated the thought and politics of the period, and that they, again, edited the tales, expanded the tales to incorporate their personal prejudices, really suggests to me that there's a much more active engagement with the racial thinking and racist ideologies of the time period, right? This is not just color symbolism. Of the 4 tales featuring Black characters, the 3 Black princesses really stands out in 2 very distinct ways. One is its named setting outside of German-speaking Europe, and 2, the other is the permanence of the 3 princesses' Blackness. So if you had a chance to read the story, you know it's rife with odd, at times nonsensical details and plot elements. It's pretty rough. It seems like maybe it was cobbled together from a number of different stories. And indeed, according to the notes, it's pretty clear that it was. And yet, there's still meaning to be made in some of these oddities. So again, the 3 Black princesses is perhaps most remarkable for its opening 2 words, East India. And here I read East India as a site of what I'm calling racialized slippage. That is, it is the fisherman's son who is East Indian, right? And the 3 Black princesses, however, are the ones who are made to be associated with this foreign place in the story, right? They're Black, they have these ferocious animalistic brothers, and they're vulnerable to the consecrated candle, that is to Christianity. They are the ones who are stereotypically and ideologically associated with East India and its assumed radical otherness. In reality, of course, we know that there were Christians living in Asia and the Middle East during the 18th and 19th centuries, but the Oriental locale of East India was much more likely to function as a signifier of racial, religious, or racialized religious difference versus as a historical geographic marker. So as an anchor for the tale's racialization, the East Indian setting is also imbricated with the other kind of astounding feature of this tale, which is that the permanence of the 3 princesses' Blackness. So in the other stories, all the other Black characters are cursed or enchanted to Blackness, and then they are disenchanted and become white, right? But here, these 3 Black princesses, even though they tell the fisherman's son that he can rescue them, their Blackness is permanent. And we never know exactly what the curse is, or even what the effect of the curse is. We only know that they need to be rescued. We don't know what they need to be rescued from. The hero, probably like the Grimm's readers, likely assumes that the princesses have to be rescued from their Blackness because that's the common trope in all the other fairy tales. But their outrage at being touched by the wax of the consecrated candle opens up a range of other possibilities, right? If Blackness is the condition from which they have to be rescued, also there's no hope for them because their Blackness is in their blood. You'll remember that when the wax from the consecrated candle hits them, quote, their blood, they talk about their blood that will cry for vengeance. And so in this context, the East Indian locale provides the kind of ready associations necessary to smooth over the tale's distinctly atypical fairy tale features, right? Broad Orientalist tropes anti-Semitic and otherwise, rationalize the hero's failure, the impossibility of saving these diabolical Blacks who ultimately return. Remember, they're like irate and they're vengeful, they're chained, they're subhuman. They return back into the earth. They basically return to hell, right? So whatever their plight is, whatever the curse is, Christianity cannot save them because race and all its attendant forms of inferiority exist in the blood. So even though Germany had all these Christian missionary efforts, race was still understood in the German context as an absolute and unalterable marker of difference. And I think we can really see this in the this proverbial sentiment that regenerating the Jew through baptism would be as effective as, quote, trying to wash a blackamoor white, right? So that's a very common proverb, and it was often applied to this ideas of converting Jews. So if the Grimm's tales featuring Black characters bear the unmistakable imprint of racialized Christianity or racialized Christian ideology, even more striking is the way that the racial legacy of the fairy tale itself influences these tales. So in particular, in The White Bride and the Black Bride, and the constellation of other tales in the collection in Children's and Household Tales, the other versions of kind and unkind girls and true and false brides, and there are quite a number of them. So in these tales, we really see echoes of the sometimes stark and sometimes more elusive overtly racialized themes from Basile, right, that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. We see those themes from the literary versions of the same tales being picked up here. And I should say the Grimms themselves note the similarities to a number of European versions of the kind and unkind girls, including a story by D'Aulnoy called Rosette. And they also cite Basile's Two Little Pizzas, which we didn't talk about much, but that was the story in which that line about that blackamoor of a knight playing the tuba katuba that I unpacked, it is in that story. What is remarkable, though, is that the Grimms, who knew Basile extremely well, in fact, they had planned to translate his whole collection, omit any reference to the three citrons and to the frame tale, where we see the very explicit racializing, right? We have very explicit literal slave girls there occupying the roles of the unkind girl or the false bride. So I think it's pretty notable that they omit those and continue with just the sort of very metaphoric color symbolism kinds of notes that they're making. So I want to return us to this fairy tale genealogy of the White Bride and the Black Bride, though, because I believe this history makes especially clear the tale's underlying and I would say undeniable racialization. One of the most striking and to me oddest motifs of the White Bride and the Black Bride is when this white duck shows up and asks the kitchen boy, "What's the Black Witch doing in the house?" And hopefully, since it's only been a week or two since we talked about this, you'll remember that these words echo so clearly the three citrons when the white dove, who you'll remember is the avatar of the fairy born of the citron, the true bride, asked cook in the kitchen, "What is the king doing with the Saracen?" And as you'll remember, I think from last week, Saracen was itself a racialized term, even though Saracens were not all Black. In Basile, the Saracen is a stand-in for Black, and the king in the story, in the three citrons, later refers to the Saracen as the Black Queen. So we see that connection made very explicitly there. But this fairy tale genealogy also lends insight into the ways that race, often figuratively, informs this entire group of tales about kind and unkind girls and about true and false brides in the Grimm's collection. And those tales include Mother Holle, the Three Little Gnomes in the Forest, the Singing Springing Lark, the Goose Girl, and of course the White and the Black Bride. So if we do an intertextual reading of these tales together with Basile's tales, I think the racial logic extends, the racial logic of the collection, of the Grimm's collection, extends well beyond the four tales where we see explicitly Black characters. In Mother Hola, for instance, the black pitch that permanently covers one of the unkind girl as punishment for laziness and impudence not only metaphorizes the unkind girl's literal blackness in the white bride and the black bride, but it also highlights the race nature of the descriptions that the Grimms invoke for this particular unkind girl. They call her the lazy maiden, a loafer who does not want to get out of bed in the morning, and a dirty maiden. And then again, if you recall the typologies, laziness was a racialized category. This kind of cascading set of signifiers also reframes the unkind girl who also becomes a false bride in the Three Little Gnomes in the Forest, such that her, quote, wicked and greedy heart, her stinginess, and her, quote, growing uglier with each day that passes. That's thanks to the gifts of the gnomes. And also the fact that she spits toads from her mouth every time she tries to speak. These all take on racial dimensions, right? And racially anti-Semitic dimensions. So even though those characteristics are not overtly sutured to Black skin, traits such as ugliness, laziness, sloth, and greed call to mind many of the common anti-Semitic and anti-Black stereotypes from the period. And the unkind girls speaking in toads, if you will, literalizes the belief that Jews and Blacks could never speak proper German. So again, these chains of signifiers, I think, take us back to these typologies. They reproduce the language of the typologies that were so common in the period. So the unkind girl or the false bride is always lazy, deceitful, impudent, and can't speak proper German, ugly, and is compared, of course, to the beautiful, white, innocent, hardworking, kind girl or true bride. And this really brings the kind of typology to life, right? It animates the typology in the language of the tales. But even beyond being stories of the beautiful and the ugly, or the German and the other, these tales carry forward, often in metaphoric and fantastic ways, the accumulated racial formations of the earlier literary versions, in which these very explicit racial ideas inhere, right? So they carry forward all of the racial underpinnings of Basile's tales, but now they're metaphorized. And in this way, I think they also reveal the complicity of the fairy tale as a genre in the everyday acceptance and everyday naturalization of these racialized ideas. That is, those weird details in the fairy tale that I mentioned at the start of class that we often just accept as being part of the fairy tale might actually be meaningful when we read them in these historical contexts, but we're so willing to let go of those oddities because it's a fairy tale, right? So the fairy tale itself as a genre is complicit in carrying forward these racial formation projects. So just a couple more examples. In the story, there's a story called Hans My Hedgehog, and he goes through he's born hedgehog, much like Prince Marquessan, and he goes through all these trials and tribulations, and eventually he's disenchanted, but when he's disenchanted, he's entirely Black. And then he uses this ointment and he becomes white. And this is a very odd detail. No one has ever commented on it before. And I just want to suggest that if we put this tale in a broader historical context and read it in relationship to Prince Marquessan, for example, perhaps his Blackness, Hans My Hedgehog's initial Blackness upon being disenchanted, is not that unusual when we see the correspondences with Prince Marquessan, who was this kind of stand-in for a sauvage, right, for a native man in that French context. Similarly, there's a story called The Singing Springing Lark, which is a version of Beauty and the Beast and a true bride, false bride kind of tale. And here, I think in the collection, one of the only 3 examples where a specific geographic locale is mentioned. So there's East India, there's a story about Bremen, so that's in Germany. And then here there's a reference to the Red Sea. And this seems totally out of place in a fairy tale, especially in the Grimms, where everything is so fantastic. But if we read the story in relationship to Apuleius's Cupid and Psyche, if we read it in relationship to Basile's The Padlock and The Golden Trunk, and then to D'Aulnoy's stories of magical transformation, Villeneuve, and Beaumont, we can really see through all of those accumulated racializations, metaphorized and literal in the story, that the Red Sea could be an othering boundary between the realm of the true bride and the realm of the false bride. And it also exposes or helps us understand the tacit racializing of 2 characters. The false bride also happens to be a dragon princess, and her father is an obviously non-Christian sorcerer. So I think this Red Sea as a marker, as a boundary for her realm, helps us make sense of those other details. So again, it's just to wrap up, it's so easy for us to skim over these oddities and these seemingly nonsensical features of the fairy tale because it's a fairy tale world and fairy tales are weird in their own right. But I think when you read them not only within their immediate historical, political, social context, but also read them in a bigger genealogy of the European fairy tale, we can really see that not that they are meaningless or nonsensical, but in fact, the very opposite, that they're laden with meaning, and we just have to understand how to get at that meaning. Okay, thank you. Pretty close to time today. Next week, we'll talk about Lang. So I didn't assign anything there. And then I want us to end the second lecture will be really on what I think as like a positive direction for the future. So I'm going to talk about some people who have written tales or done art projects that respond to some of the racism here and try to resist or reimagine that. So that's where we'll go next week.